I'm Adrian Wooldridge. I write the Schumpeter column for The Economist. The last time I came to a Labour Party conference, and indeed to Brighton, was in 1994, when I had dinner, The Economist had dinner collectively with the two new crowned kings of the Labour Party in the form of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I haven't got such an invitation this evening from Mr. Corbyn, unfortunately. But I'm very, very pleased to be here to address this conference. This side meeting conference. I'm very pleased to introduce the panel. On my right, immediate right, is Petra Wilton, Director of Strategy at the CMI. On my far right, which is a phrase I'm enjoying using, I have Will Hutton, Principal of Hertford College, Oxford, and a veteran columnist from The Guardian and Observer. On my immediate left, Professor Jeff Moore of Durham University, and we are going to have, at some point, John Mann, a member of the Treasury Committee, but he will enter when he enters and speak when he speaks. I think this is a great and fascinating subject. It springs from the notion that there's no real tension between being morally virtuous and being economically successful as a business. That you don't have to sacrifice your morality, you don't have to sacrifice your values and ethics in order to be successful. On the contrary, if you are moral, if you have a vision of virtue, if you have a shared and admirable purpose as a business, you're much more likely to be successful. What gets in the way of that? Well, I think people at ResPublica would argue that it's a sort of set of attitudes, a set of values, a way of looking at the world which really gets in the way of effectiveness. It's partly an emphasis on efficiency, partly an emphasis on top-down management, partly an emphasis on rational choice theory, which sees people as sort of donkeys who need to be tempted with sticks and punished, need to be tempted with carrots and punished with sticks. And this sort of Taylorist view of management, I think, according to this view, gets in the way of business success. I must say, I personally am very much in two minds about whether this is true. On the one hand, I love the notion of virtue. I think that's a word that we should use much more often in the world of management and business. It's a great word. I like the notion that companies are driven by a sense of purpose and a sense of values, and I think that's a true description of what drives most of us in our work. I must say, when I go to work for The Economist every day, or whenever I do go, which perhaps isn't every day, I'm not driven by the notion of making profits for the shareholders. I'm driven by the notion of doing a good job, of writing good journalism, and also by the notion that my colleagues are people that I enjoy being with and who treat me in a reasonable way. And I think that's true of most people who operate in the business world. However, I want to raise a few questions about whether this notion of doing well and doing right actually works quite as well as we would like it to, just to add a little bit of dissent here, or a sense of what we need to be discussing during this hour or so. One is the question of, are there really no trade-offs in the world? I do think there are trade-offs in the world which we have to constantly make between being good, being nice on the one hand, and being successful at business at the other. These are difficult trade-offs, and we can't always have everything. You can't have everything. If we look at the much vaunted Germanic stakeholder model of capitalism, where you have a lot of this emphasis on quarterly results, where you have long-term ownership. Let's look at Volkswagen. It's a company that's owned partly by the government of Lower Saxony, partly by trade unions, partly by families who have a couple of families who have a long-term vision of capitalism. It exemplifies all these things which doing good and doing right people tend to emphasize, and now, of course, it's in the middle of a gigantic scandal which is driven by pursuing success to the exclusion of all else. Or think of the co-op again, which is basically the embodiment of virtue and good management, and became the embodiment of something else. there are very, very difficult trade-offs which we have to keep making in capitalism. I was just looking recently at the 6 companies in the United States which have the longest job tenure, such as GM and Kodak. Every single one of these companies is either bankrupt or has been in bankruptcy proceedings in the last 10 years. So that seems to be an area of, on the one hand, virtue, keeping these workers there for a long time. On the other hand, not great business success. And I think this trade-off between virtue on the one hand and moral and business success on the other is actually becoming more and more difficult to make in the modern, highly disruptive business economy. What the most successful companies now are trying to do is to practice what I call the capitalism of zero. They basically want to have no employees, no commitments, and no assets, because that's the only way to survive in a very disruptive world. So you have what Google has 50,000 employees, I think Facebook has 9,000, Twitter has 3,000, Dropbox, which we all love, has less than 1,000 workers. So we seem to have this model that the most successful companies, the ones that are changing and transforming entire industries, don't really have much in the way of commitments to workers because they don't have much in the way of workers. And this asset-light, worker-light, rather ruthless version of capitalism, I think is driven by 2 very powerful forces. One is me and you, basically consumers who want to get stuff for nothing or stuff for as little as possible, and these are the services that we choose to have. And secondly is investors. Investment is increasingly now being done in a ruthlessly efficient and mechanical way. And companies that can deliver value are rewarded. Companies that can't deliver value are punished. BlackRock, which has 4.7 trillion in assets, basically allocates a lot of those assets purely on the basis of electronic trading. It's nothing to do with virtue, it's nothing to do with making long-term commitments. This trading is done by machines which allocate money to the places where the investors, i.e. you and me, are going to get the fastest and the best returns. So BlackRock became the biggest owner of Apple's stock, not because it thought Apple was a virtuous company, but because it thought the machines that allocate the capital thought that this was going to be the best value for money. So on the one hand, I feel very emotionally attracted to this notion of virtue, and the word virtue very attractive. On the other hand, it strikes me that it's ignoring the importance of trade-offs in capitalism, and that those trade-offs are becoming more and more ruthless and difficult to make. With that long peroration, I think I'm now going to ask Petra to give 5 minutes, and then Will, and then
right, well,
Professor Moore.
Thank you very much, and that's something to follow. Why is the CMI interested in the UK's position as a global leader in business culture? Well, as a professional body, we're all about creating better led and better managed organisations. In fact, we're chartered to try and raise more ethical behaviours in business. But, as mentioned, Volkswagen, as a prime example, we've got a long way to go. And when we look at how people rate their managers and leaders in the UK, it's the managers and leaders who set the business culture that we're talking about today. Only 43% rate their managers as ineffective. And that's perhaps not surprising, because actually only 1 in 5 of our managers and leaders have any formal management or leadership training. So they're actually making decisions, they're making strategy decisions on the basis of no formal training. They're normally from another profession. People get promoted as what we call accidental managers. They're good at what they do. They might be great at finance, great engineers, doctors, teachers, and then they become leaders of their organisation, being responsible as role models, setting the culture, but then they're struggling in terms of how do they do that, how do they inspire the workforce, how do they create a democratic coaching culture that brings out the best in everyone. They have not had the training to do that. They'll be technical experts, but can't actually engage and actually lead by example in terms of where we're setting what virtue looks like. So, although we're not very good at it at the moment, we don't really value management as a profession, We have got professional standards, we have got a charter which people do sign up to, a bit like the oath, which we've heard from bankers. So that is one way of changing culture. We did a commission last year with the all-party parliamentary group on management and came up with, too many P's here, 3 P's of what good looks like in management and leadership. And we actually looked at the best across the UK society, some of the hallowed names like Unilever and what Paul Foreman's been doing as a blueprint for better business. His junked quarterly reporting is really focused on purpose of business. They're not about just creating profit from soap suds, profit's a part of it, but they're also about solving hygiene in Africa. And they're encouraging people to come to work to actually do the job, not just to make money. You also see John Lewis and also a number of small businesses. We've heard from Winsor London, which is a new fashion company which was set up by an individual fed up with the corporate lifestyle and wants to really make a difference by focusing on school leavers and female returners and setting their own agenda. There's no fixed office. They work in a very different way. So business cultures can change and they do need to be far more inclusive if they're going to be effective. What we've also been looking at is how do you also change the culture through ownership models. How do you actually fundamentally look at how do you make an organisation democratic, and our latest report on the seats today is about the virtues and the ethics of employee-owned companies. This has been a train of study that we've been looking at in terms of ethical decision-making in organisations. People make decisions on the basis of 3 core ethics: the ethics of care, the ethics of reason, that rational choice which we heard about in Taylorism, and the ethics of obedience, the ethics of compliance. They do what's right and then they work around the rules as long as they're staying within the law. So we've got those 3 ethics, and what we saw when we did major surveys of nearly 100,000 managers is everyone tends to leave the ethics of care at home. What they're doing is they're going into the workplace and it's a different organisation culture, and they feel that they can make a decision based on rational, what makes the most profit, they can make a decision on what's within the rules, but they completely forget the ethic of care. In fact, we just heard, commenting on the recent VW example, the Vincent Nichols, the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, said too many people in big business are living a divided life, ignoring the moral values that they uphold when they're with their families. So they're leaving those at home and creating a different environment when they're in the workplace. Why should there be that divide? Why can't we bring the ethics of care into the workplace? And it is about how do you fundamentally democratise the workplace so that we really do value employers. Part of that comes back to reporting. Companies are reporting, as I mentioned, Unilever scrapped the quarterly reporting, but they're reporting on profits, costs, they're not reporting on assets, and they're not reporting on people, which is 80% of the balance sheet now, not as an asset in how they add value. And until we start to change that, and there's good work we're doing with the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, SEMA and others, to say actually you need to measure what matters and then set targets around that. And if you actually really value your people as assets and your employees, you can actually then start to change the culture. So that's just a quick insight. We could go on for a long time, there's lots of questions there, but we do need to change and be far more transparent about what matters in business culture, and then start setting targets and measuring what matters. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think there's a widespread sense that Western capitalism has gone rogue over the last period. I mean, it's the banking crisis was one manifestation of it. Other manifestations are a string of British companies that have got themselves in difficulties closely analogous to those of VW, BP, Tesco, Leap to Mine. Rolls-Royce is helping officials with fraud inquiries in both Brazil and in Indonesia. GSK was in trouble with Chinese authorities, and there's been a kind of cutting corners and lack of virtuous behaviour. Of course, when a German representative does it, everyone leaps on it as Aon does, as a kind of example of how the stakeholder system is dysfunctional too. And I do think that it's a very important moment, and it's a very important moment for the Labour Party, having they've elected Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's speech today, a real kind of Nixon in China moment, saying things that Ed Balls would have said quite happily, but getting applauded for it. There's kind of, seems to me there's two propositions that won't wash in 2015 in front of an increasingly angry and disillusioned electorate. I think proposition one, although an enormous amount of what Adrian said I agreed with, but I don't think you can fall back on the kind of economist leader line. It's all very tricky and full of complicated trade-offs, so you can't do very much really. You have to do something. There has to be some movement away from these kind of increasingly kind of toxic moments like the one we've lived through with VW and the banks. And the other one, proposition I don't think that you can get away with, is the capitalism is such shit, we're going to have to transform it. I don't buy that either. We just know that attempts to do that have not worked. They open up the door to all kinds of authoritarianism. They're inefficient in their own right. And actually, if you can get it right, a capitalism that works is innovative, is dynamic, does kind of deliver the golden, it is the goose that delivers the golden egg. And I think we get to that capitalism via hard wiring into it a whole series of checks and balances. Those checks and balances are about empowered consumers, they're about empowered unions, they're about shareholders who kind of own with the directors' team a share a sense of purpose. They're about non-executive directors who ferociously scrutinize the action of directors' teams. But all of that is valueless if the actors do not exhibit what ResPublica interestingly describes as virtue. You see, companies in both Britain and in particular in America, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, when they incorporated, had to incorporate around a declaration of business purpose. And I would argue, it's not speaking just for a few minutes, that actually a purposed capitalism informed by people who take risks, but with some sense that they're about not only making, that they are about human betterment, they are about solving great human problems from which they aim to make a lot of money, is the kind of right way for the syllogism to kind of run, just to say that a business is about making money and nothing else, and you get yourself into kind of very deep water very, very quickly. I think over the last 30 years, the shareholder value revolution, interacting with, in Britain, a very particular form of company law, and a very, very extraordinary change in the structure of the ownership of British companies. The ONS reported just a couple of weeks back that pension funds that in the mid-80s owned 30% of the equity of British companies now own only 3%. And insurance companies that I think at the same time owned around 20% of British equity now own 5%. So in the long-term investment institutions, such as insurance companies and pension funds, own less than 10% of British equity. And the ownership structure is interactive with kind of capital market preoccupations with shareholder value maximization to kind of import a kind of ferocious myopia and kind of risk aversion into the boardrooms of British enterprise. And it's been, in a big way, depurposed. And one way of understanding that is that the people at the helm of our great enterprises don't think there's a kind of a moral code or an ethical dimension. Actually, many of them do, but the incentive system and the structures in which they operate compel them to behave differently. A number of companies that members of the Big Innovation Centre, so very senior household names, will say that they are compelled to getting themselves involved in share buybacks or excessive distribution to shareholders, rather than investment projects that would, over a period, sustain their enterprise over time, that they're penalised for good behaviour. So for me, I do think that you have to, whilst accepting there's a broader agreement with the introductory remarks of the chair, I think that one has to make, in a sense, a powerful declaration that purposed enterprise, driven and animated by women and men who have some sense of what a virtuous conduct is actually the lodestone for navigating between the twin perils of just saying there's lots of tricky trade-offs, but we have to leave it to markets, or we have to engage in a kind of socialisation transformation project, which actually there is no popular support for and probably won't work once you pulled it off. So you have to open this very difficult area of actually how you get, not just how you get the structures of good corporate governance, which I would say do exist in Germany, but how you populate it in a way with the checks and balances that are needed. The difficulty with Volkswagen was it was the family owners voted as a bloc. Saxony represented another fifth of the equity, and the Qataris close to another fifth. And it became, as the Süddeutsche Zeitung said, run a bit like North Korea. The Germans themselves don't believe that Volkswagen corresponded to the precepts of stakeholder capitalism as they understand it. It was captured by Mr. Winterkorn and his obsessed by production and jobs and profits, the metrics by which he was measured. If you look at the remuneration committee reports at Volkswagen over the last 15 years, are a fascinating read. Watching the amount of, it used to be that all the directors at Volkswagen got paid base pay, and that was that. And over the last 15 years, they moved to a position in which they were shareholder value maximisers. An incredible amount of their pay got paid in share options and long-term incentive plans, about delivering a combination of an upward movement in the share price and actually some kind of reduction and employment metrics to cross-correct the share price metrics. And what they're debating in Germany is actually how does one open a system up like that? How does one retain the advantages of stakeholding and actually get some independent voices at the table, holding people like Winterkorn to account, who plainly, as the Germans now think, because they launched a potential criminal prosecution against him, must have known that he was fitting millions of vehicles with a software that suppressed the results of nitrogen dioxide emissions. So just to say a last word, I think this agenda that Philip and ResPublica are trying to get opened up is the correct one. I think we need to repurpose British enterprise in order to permit it to take more risks. It's become a highly risk-averse kind of setup. Asset light and worker light, as Adrian said, not innovating, not investing. There's only 3 companies in Britain, BT, Unilever and Rolls-Royce, that actually registered more than 100 patents last year, and that is completely unbelievable. The patenting record is dire. The R&D is now in the bottom quartile of the EU. The numbers of companies that are genuinely at the frontier of the so-called knowledge economy are tiny. There's only ARM, based half in Cambridge and half in Palo Alto, as part of the new economy. We really are losing out by having a depurposed, de-risked kind of enterprise sector, which, unable to navigate its way, is actually falling back on doing nothing. Maybe if we had incentive structures that actually kind of rewarded virtue, we might do a great deal better. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think in what I want to say, it will follow very much on from what Petra and Will have already said, but hopefully develop in 1 or 2 novel directions. I just want to make 3 points in my 5 minutes. First, I think the stakeholder approach in business has made as much progress as it is ever likely to achieve, but ultimately it's been captured by business. You'll be familiar, I guess, with the stakeholder approach, possibly from Will's book, the 1995 book, The State We're In, which was influential, of course, in Labour's thinking coming into the 97 general election, and was realised to some extent in the 2006 Companies Act. Business has taken that terminology on board, and it's the most common way of talking about coming at corporate social responsibility, CSR. It's also the way we tend to teach CSR in business schools. But I think what business has come to realise, perhaps almost intuitively, is that stakeholders can be used as a means to the end of shareholder wealth maximisation, such that a kind of utilitarian business case for CSR has tended to dominate. In other words, only do ethics if it pays. The best that this approach leads to is strategic corporate social responsibility, where in theory at least business's interests and society's interests somehow magically align. And interestingly, while the empirical evidence, the academic empirical evidence, suggests that those businesses who perform well on social and environmental metrics also perform well financially, ethics does pay, apparently, there has to be a concern that CSR has simply become another aspect of business strategy and has lost its link with ethics. So if we're really to make progress in terms of business making its contribution to the common good, we need, I think, a different way of coming at business and its role in society. So my second point is that just such an approach has been and is being worked out, particularly in academia, I think, but also in practice. Virtue in Business, the title of our event here, is a good summary of it. And virtue, of course, is much more than prohibition or chastity at the individual level. Applied to business organisations, it asks questions, and this picks up very much on what we've already said, about the purpose of the organisation. Why does it exist? And how, through its products and services and the development of its people, does it serve the common good? And there are similarities, again, with Will's call for companies to declare their business purpose on incorporation, to deliver particular goods and services that serve a societal or an economic need. So this approach prioritises the pursuit of excellence of these things over financial success, perhaps back to this question of trade-offs and reputation of the organisation, arguing that these things are good things in their own right, and that it is only by concentrating now on the excellence of products and services and people that long-term survival and success is achieved in any case. And by encouraging a long-term perspective, it also asks fundamental questions about ecological sustainability, where again I think the current stakeholder approach tends to see green issues as merely another short-term business case issue, rather than requiring a fundamental shift in business's approach. And my third point is simply that there is already some evidence of this being worked out in practice, of business organisations which have or are beginning to adopt this approach, even if they wouldn't necessarily recognise it in these terms, use this terminology. We're familiar with organisations like the Mondragon Cooperative, Scott Barder, John Lewis, as Patrick has already mentioned, which for many years have realised a successful cooperative business model with a focus on their workers. In terms of shareholder-owned organisations, perhaps again Unilever is the best example with its sustainable living plan. Boeing, BT, the Guardian Media Group are other businesses which Will cites as being in this mould. At a smaller level, I think we also need to look at smaller level fair trade organisations like Tradecraft, but perhaps social enterprises more generally provide other examples. One recently established organisation that's promoting this approach to business, and Petra's already mentioned it, Blueprint for a Better Business. It draws on Catholic social teaching, interestingly, which also informs Blue Labour. And this encourages businesses to define and operate to a purpose that serves society and respects the dignity of people, and to nourish a culture through which behaviours needed to deliver that purpose can flourish. It challenges businesses to be a force for good, and already has a number of household names working with it to try to realise these principles. So all told then, I think there is a new model for business emerging, both in theory and in practice, which can do much to generate the much needed business culture, changing business culture, where business serves the common good. And it can do so much on its own, I think, this initiative, but it will also need political and I think possibly legislative support if it's to realise its potential. And that's, of course, where the Labour Party perhaps comes in. Thank you.
Talking of the Labour Party coming in, we now have John Mann, MP, member of the Treasury Committee, who's going to give us his view on this subject.
Well, thank you, and sorry for a delayed arrival. I've been in another fringe meeting, such as the complexities of these cultures, we might say, of perhaps you might say of politicians, as well as these kind of conferences. I wanted to differentiate types of businesses into three. Not by doing the usual, which I've done plenty of times in the past, by categorising the first as almost evil, or medieval in their approach. Certainly, it's easy to do that. And one could go through and look at the banking industry in particular, and quantify the levels of criminality, quantify the business lost opportunity by the levels of fines, and what that should have been if properly applied and equitably applied across the whole of the sector, and demonstrate that there was a culture of greed, a culture of excessive risk-taking, and a culture that strayed, therefore, all too easily into criminality, because the model was defined as success at all costs, success defined as profitability by you and you personally, on behalf of your institution. And that's true. But I don't think that has to happen just because it's banking. I could take the example of lawyers. I took 43 firms of lawyers successfully through disciplinary processes at the Solicitors Regulation Agency for fiddling retired coal miners and their families out of industrial injury compensation. 12 of those firms had people struck off for doing so. Again, a level of, I can't describe it as criminality, though one was jailed, but of impropriety of an extraordinary level, and culturally so, whereby they were only the ones that I could identify in my area as one small part of the country. The same thing was happening across the rest of the country. An entire profession there of those active in this particular field calculatingly ripping off a disadvantaged group, despite the fact they were being exceedingly well remunerated in the first place. So one could go on and categorise bad business ethics and why it's a problem. But that doesn't solve the problem either of why it happens. So what I, in thinking about this, have come up with is three kinds of companies. The worst kind is the transactional company. And the transactional company sees financial transaction as the key. And so it can be categorised these days as those companies who will contract out because it's cheaper, without thinking through whether the quality of output from the people they brought in is as good as what it would have been if they'd have attempted to maintain a highly motivated, permanently employed workforce. And there are plenty of examples emerging now of companies that have reversed that concept, because they've realised that if you motivate people, as opposed to purely seeing them as people to pay, whatever level, be it the top bankers to the cheapest cleaners and production workers, whatever the level of remuneration, if you treat people not just as a transaction in the business, then in fact their output will be higher. There's a huge amount of evidence over the years of that. And one can see, as an example, that well-organised, trade unionised workplaces had higher productivity than those that didn't have unions in. Why? Because actually, a lot of the fears and problems of the workforce, the conflicts that there might be in the workplace, were dealt with voluntarily by representatives of the workforce themselves, rather than landing on senior management's desk and distracting them, or lying untouched and distracting the productive nature of the company. That's well documented historically. But that is the first kind, that is the weakest kind, that is the one that banking, in my view, falls into, the transactional company. Everything based on a transaction between the people in there. That is the current ethos still of business, and increasingly over recent years of business in this country. It's a fundamental weakness. The second kind is equally bad, though very different. I would categorise it as the old boys kind of company, whereby you appoint people who you like, you appoint people who you know, you appoint people whose fathers or mothers you know. And that's very, very strong in many sectors of British industry and commerce, and is a fundamental weakness. If you look at the political world, it's worse than anywhere for that. We are the very worst at that. And the two political leaders who have been most effective in achieving what they wanted to achieve, I'm not making a commentary on their priorities or politics, but in achieving what they set out to achieve, are Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair. And what both of them did really interestingly, in the teams around them, whether it was deliberately or initially accidentally, is they employed people around them who weren't like them. That, to me, is a good leadership and business culture. They had people around them they did not like. And while superficially they may have papered over their dislike of those people, that is the case with both of them. And with Blair, when I was able to see it very first hand, it was one of his key strengths. He was prepared to have people in who he was not comfortable with, in at the heart of things with him, personally with him, telling him what to do, advising him how to do things. And he often was fairly explosive, especially early on. That is counter to the old boys network that is so prevalent, politics, but so prevalent in British industry, and such a weakness. And if you take the legal profession, it's perhaps at its worst there. You have people like yourself, people who you know, people who your father knew, or people who's the offspring of people who's the sons and daughters of people you know, and that becomes the ethos inside the business. Fundamentally weak in terms of business ethics. It's a comfort factor. There is the problem there. The third kind, I have a working group in Silicon Valley with the fancy internet companies, and therefore I have lots of dealings with them. And what I've noted there is not the superficial jazziness of luxury ice creams available for free, of multicoloured bikes to cycle in at, and other gimmickry which people seem to like a lot in all of them. That's not what differentiates them. What differentiates them is the extraordinary level of leadership expected at every level. I would define those companies and the culture within them as leadership based, whereby leadership is defined as telling other people, you will make the decision. Not me because I am above you, you will make the decision. You are authorised to make the decision. Indeed, you're not going to work here if you don't make the decision. And the only similarity I've really seen with that is in German manufacturing, where with the Meister system, the people at the heart of German manufacturing were the managers of the machines, not the minders of machines, which is why German manufacturing has outperformed the rest of the world for so long. It is your machine, you lead what happens with that machine, you are responsible. Don't come to me with the problems. That leadership model is the cultural model that we ought to be promoting in this country, but it comes at a price for companies. Because in terms of remuneration, it's going to have to be more equitable. Because if you're saying to the people, quotes at the bottom of the company, in the least skilled areas, that you're expected to show leadership, you can't have the levels of differentials in remuneration that you can have and do have in the other two models. And it also requires trust. And trust isn't easy. It isn't easy to recruit and keep on the basis that the person you're putting in there is going to have to deliver because you're giving them the power to do so. It's empowering the workforce, and it is that model that's led to the success, in my judgment, in Silicon Valley. And it is that model that we should apply in this country if we want a business culture that rebuilds the country as a world leader.
Thank you very much. I truly love the notion of Silicon Valley as a model of equality and remuneration. But now we're going to open it up to questions. Can we have questions from the floor, please? We've got half an hour. This gentleman at the back.
Sorry, yeah, Philip Long, Director of ResPublica. I think the question Adrian that you posed is the right one, which essentially I think is how do you crowd out bad behaviour with good, or how does bad behaviour crowd out good? That seems to me to be where we are. I mean, and if as it were, the aim of business used to be to create externalities which you didn't have to cover, a business that tries to incorporate those externalities will lose against a business that doesn't. But I think what was conflated in your question, I don't think is right, i.e. that modern successful companies are necessarily unethical. One could imagine a good Google, one that doesn't engage in monopolistic behaviour, that contracts. Yes, it might have employees, but it might pay the people it deals with well, might have very low costs, but still, on every point, make it work. I mean, arguably that's what's happening with advanced manufacturing. So I think I would want to open up a distinction between the modern being unethical, because I don't think it necessarily is, and what unethical behaviour lies. So the question is this, is if the real question is how can we reward good companies and penalise bad? What are the ideas you might have? So on the demand side, the great problem seems to me that consumers can't and don't seem to select for good companies. They don't seem to select for companies that price in the externalities. They also seem to select and can select for companies that create externalities and do the cheapest. I just wondered what the panel thought might be the other incentives that the state might apply, and markets might apply, and culture might apply, that could actually police out the bad companies.
Can I just start by saying that the point behind my introduction was to question this idea that there's an automatic relation between morally good behaviour and business success. It's something we'd all like to see the case, but I don't think there is an automatic relationship. Indeed, I think the relationship is becoming more difficult because of disruptive technologies of various sorts, globalisation and the rest of the list. So you can quite often be a good company and do very badly, and you can quite often be a very bad company, a very ruthless company, and do commercially very well. We have to recognise that. That's a fact about the world. I love your point about crowding out bad behaviour. trying to exclude bad behaviour. I think we have to be very careful about not defining bad behaviour up to include every aspect of profit seeking or any aspect of business behaviour. We have to be very specific about what we mean by bad behaviour, ethical behaviour. And I think there are two things. I mean, Will and I can get into an endless debate about chartered companies, and perhaps that wouldn't be a good thing. But I think there are two things that are really important in this, and that the state has a big role, could have a big role in enforcing. One is the quality of corporate culture, which I wish we talked a little bit more about, and that is embedding within the company's culture a set of sort of instinctive behaviours that you do, and companies need to understand that in a world in which managerial decisions are being much more devolved to the front line, that you manage through culture, rather than through top-down orders. And the second is the quality of boards and the nature of boards. I think that boards are exceptionally weak as key institutions of capitalism. They're antiquated institutions. They're being asked to do too many things. Because they're being asked to do too many things, they're doing most of them badly. A lot of what boards are doing is about checking on the compliance, essentially. And I think you'd be much better off separating the compliance function and allocating that out to sort of professional bodies, big sort of consultancies which do nothing but check on compliance, and therefore you have economies of scale and professionalism and the rest of it, and then have boards to do the sort of the more strategic work. So in other words, you would be creating a professional set of organisations whose job is to keep an eye on companies to see if they're compliant. At the moment, compliance is done by people who are not in that position to do it. So I think there are two solutions to this problem of behaviour, rule breaking. One is within the companies to have strong cultures, and the other is better oversight of companies through a real rethinking of what boards are about and how boards operate.
On that one, I think one of the key ways of how do we crowd out bad behaviour is about transparency fundamentally. I think we heard today from the Shadow Chancellor that one of the issues they're looking to tackle is the gender pay gap, which is still 19%. We've had legislation in place now for 45 years to say that paying men and women different rates is illegal. That hasn't made a difference. We've still got a gender pay gap. What's now finally coming in with Section 78 is that companies are being required to publish the data on gender pay. So companies are not actually going out to do the wrong thing, the majority, but they're not aware of actually what the data is. So by actually publishing that, they can start to tackle it. And Tesco's, who may not be virtuous at everything in this debate, but what they have done is they have published their gender pay over the last this 5 years, and they now have a gender pay gap of 0.45%, which is nothing compared to the 19-20% that we see in many other companies. So by actually targeting data and actually measuring, as I mentioned, what really matters, so if we really are trying to have distributed leadership models where we are empowering employees and changing the culture, we need to start measuring that and setting targets for companies to do that. And integrated reporting is one of the moves that the Blueprint for Better Business and others and the Global Reporting Council has been moving on in terms of how do we report more on our human capital, on our people, so we really can start that measurement and actually create greater transparency. It is the media that's doing a lot. We're seeing a lot, attacking Volkswagen and many others. We hear the stories, as Will said, every corporate scandal that goes, that gets highlighted, and then you see slow progress. But the more we can introduce transparency as a real driver of behaviours, then that makes it a more democratic move to actually challenging that.
I think transparency is absolutely one of the things that we need. I'd like to turn your question around, and not about crowding out bad behaviour, but how do we crowd in virtue? As it happens, I've written an article that does exactly that, and it's called The Virtue of Governance, the Governance of Virtue, because I think that we can't just say to people, if you were really nice, if you were all really nice, then actually the company would be fine. You actually need to crowd it in by kind of governance systems. That's not necessarily the corporate governance kind of structures that we're familiar with, but it would ask that purpose question. It would talk about what sort of employees do we want. If we can recruit employees who have in the terminology pro-social intrinsic values want to be there for the right reason, the way that Adrian described, why do I go to the economist? And if we nurture that as well, so not just recruit but nurture that, you have to look at pay. I think pay and pay differentials is absolutely fundamental. Transparency comes into that, decision-making structures and how you engage the different constituencies in the organisation. All of those ways are ways in which I think you can crowd in virtue and create companies that are virtuous, and then question, are they also successful, at least in the short term, whilst the business environment changes such that they can also be successful in the long term.
I think it's another question, and then let the other two people who haven't spoken yet reply. The gentleman at the back there. Yeah, I might do that.
Yeah, Swatandra Nangamar. Two interesting points that people raised. One is about employee engagement and engagement, and one or two people have actually touched on it, and ethical work, most of behaviour and models, but very little mention of cooperatives and mutuals. And I think it's our duty to actually try and promote cooperatives and mutuals amongst the business community, because they have very little idea actually of what cooperatives and mutuals are all about. So it's a job of promotion to them, basically. And secondly, it's about what John mentioned about some of this behaviour borders onto criminality. Now, why haven't any bankers actually been prosecuted and jailed? Because that is one way of changing behaviour. And I think we need to really get really firm and strong on this.
I think yes, putting people in prison is great. Two more questions, and then we'll get one here and one here.
Hi, Phil Macaulay. I'm a social entrepreneur, and my question is really for John, which is, John, who guards the guardians? The extraordinary amount of virtueless behaviour in Parliament, with wage increases, 64 Tories on the boards of companies that are taking direct contracts and NHS privatisation, the endless stream of lobby groups in and out of Parliament by in favour. When are you going to put your own house in order?
Good question, and one more, and then we'll go to Will and John.
Hi, I'm George. I work for Tesco in the supply chain. Good to hear about the gender pay gap, or rather lack of it. So my question was that one, supply chains are extremely complex things, and that often makes companies potentially very unaccountable to the ethical practices they do. I mean, for example, Bangladesh Electric Clothing Club is the best example. Tesco put money into making sure that they work properly, but they have no incentive to do that currently. And what you envisage the state could do to try and make supply chains more accountable?
John, would you like to answer all or any of those three questions, and then we'll get Will to...
Well, I'm not going to be defending the behaviour of MPs, because the question is why. I think it's not the only question, but it's a fascinating question. Why did so many MPs fiddle their expenses? Some go to jail, others should have gone to jail and got away with it. Why? How did that happen? The culture is a career culture. It's not a good career culture, because it's normally based on pick a winner, get in with the winner, get promoted. Some people are very good at that. Some people are very bad at it. Some people don't try at all. But there is a concept of career. People, of course, don't use the term. I mean, like politicians, Labour politicians, but it is a deeply rooted concept that's there. One of the interesting facts that's never come out. No Labour MP who has outrageously treated their staff, lost employment tribunals, the worst of all employees, and done so repeatedly, ever been outed for doing so. That's the problem.
Until now.
Well, the names would shock you. They would deeply shock you. The ones I know, allegedly. But that's well known. It's well known. And indeed, that is not a bar to career success. That's a problem. What could government do? jump into one word on the second question. If I had the power, one thing I would do, I would change management schools to leadership schools, whether it's incentivising or in other ways. Management and the concept of management is a big problem. Nothing wrong with managing things well. What's lacking and missing is leadership. And don't please miss my point on the German manufacturing engineering sector. We employed for decades 4 men to supervise, manage people below them. The Germans called them engineers and gave them leadership roles. And it wasn't just a subtle difference. In the real world, it was a big difference. It was a shift of power, but it was a mindset difference. If we could do that and start having schools, if the Labour Party could work out its own schools of leadership, of defining leadership of organisations, leadership of people, leadership of offices, leadership of government departments, we would be dramatically more effective as a political force, and should we get into power, or when we're in power locally, far more effective in delivering. So that little change, or big change, difficult to do, but that would be, I think, huge.
Well, I was just looking, I want to return to this question of how do you crowd in this behaviour, which I think is the fundamental question. And I think there's a number of good points to make. And I agree with, well, I think you made a very good point about boards, but I disagree with you on one issue very much. I do think that companies that actually run themselves badly or with no eye on virtue ultimately profit. I mean, I just think that the list lengthens and the costs of it are unbelievably high. I mean, BP and VW, and actually, now Standard and Chartered, I mean, they're fighting for their lives. Deutsche Bank's fine was the biggest ever, wasn't it? $1.2 billion. These are stunning numbers. And I was very struck by a study done by LBS and Harvard, looking at 150 companies, 75 of whom had taken sustainability really to their heart, 75 were not. And over an 18-year period, the ones who'd taken sustainability seriously had performed annually 4.9% better than those who didn't. And actually, certainly, the small amount of assets I have under my control, I'd like to be invested in sustainable companies. I think you could take your idea of not-for-profit mutuals as actually surveyors of boards and use proxy votes much more aggressively than I use, pool voting power to give board scrutiny. I think we need much fewer this kind of index tracking, passive investors. We need people who really take stock selection and board behaviour and actually business strategies fundamentally more seriously than they do. And lastly, I mean, consumers are amazingly disempowered. I mean, I just don't think that the websites that do price comparisons or even which are anything like as strong enough, powerful enough, or used enough. And I also think that this kind of ethic that regulation is definitionally bad seems to me that actually, had VW taken the regulators more seriously, had there been less lobbying of regulators, had the ethic not been one which actually the right thing to do is less regulation, rather than actually regulating for kind of virtuous outcomes. Some of the scandals that we've gone through, would not have happened. I do think that we must stop this, or I believe anyway, stop this notion that actually let's get Atlas, the state, off the back of the wealth creators, because regulation is at all times, in all places, bad. Actually, regulation properly kind of deployed is a tool for very good outcomes.
I will take another couple of questions. I think we've got 10 minutes left. So less of these two.
Thank you, James Watkins Unite. I'd just like to say that this is the core of this issue when we look at business ethics, and in particular in terms of manufacturing that Will and John have picked up on is the fact that in the UK we have a very short-term business cycle mentality. And that business cycle mentality means that manufacturers and other businesses, and obviously banks are in a big space, but manufacturers and other businesses inevitably have to respond to a short-termist approach which financial institutions, amongst others, including, I have to say, government, encourages. And therefore, surely there's a role to encourage a long-termist approach, because the examples that John in particular has made, in those countries and in terms of Silicon Valley, there is a long-term approach, and I know you, John, and the Treasury Select Committee are beginning to look at those issues. And the example that Will made earlier in terms of Volkswagen, that in that situation they were beginning to have a short-termist approach in terms of where the profit line would move forward, rather than having the initial long-term approach that company is famous for. So though I understand the panel's discussion about governance and cultural issues, surely for a major push forward, looking at the business cycle would be key for the UK.
Is there another one more?
Just very quickly, I think we are going to be careful about over-fetishizing the German manufacturing model. We forget that they've internally divided the Eurozone, they push through the heart reforms, they've got a lot of working poor. So even though they have some particularly good industrial relations policies, I know some gastarbeiters from Turkey and Spain who commented that they were brought into decision-making on the factory floor. We've got to acknowledge there's a lot of geographical and historical trends that converge to give them a particularly advantageous trade position. But if they ran a 7% trade surplus last year, which compared to the 1947 US surplus of 4% is not sustainable. So I think we've got to be careful that as it does change again, that we don't find that we can just sit man in Europe and not eulogize it too much.
Well, the panel will reply. Short-termism versus long-termism. I just want to, I don't want to quite put in a word for short-termism, but let me put a word against fetishizing long-termism. Long-termism isn't the same as virtue. If I can think of the single most sort of power-praised figure I've ever come across in business, I would say that's Jeff Bezos, who's incredibly long-termist in his view of things. He wants Amazon to be the greatest, biggest store in the world where we will all go to. His investors have taken, they've been very, very patient to take Mark. He has not been, they've given him as much time as he needs to build his business. And if you read that extremely good article in the New York Times not that long ago, this is one of the most ruthless companies you can ever imagine, which squeezes its workers, which measures its workers, which monitors its workers, which forces its workers to be hyper-productive. That's not short-termism, that's his own long-termism, driven by his own desire to control the world, as far as I can see, the world of retail. In the terms of regulation, not Will is right, Atlas Shrugged is wrong, but there are many perverse consequences of regulation. One of which, if we look at the banking sector, we've responded to that by creating systemically important banks, which was effectively a huge subsidy to very big banks, and which meant that they were too big to fail twice over, and which meant that they could consolidate their position. And although regulation can quite often be a good thing, it means you're giving power to the most short-termist, most self-seeking people in society, by which I mean politicians. So if I have a choice between giving power to business people and politicians, I think I prefer business people. But look, let's have somebody else.
A couple of quick comments in terms of the long-term versus short-termism. I think it's actually the focus on purpose that we need to go, and it depends on what the purpose of the business is. It might be a short-term solution, so the business might only have a finite life cycle. So I think if we actually really focus on the purpose, which is about solving problems for the common good, if we're looking at that broader definition, then that's the issue rather than the longevity. We want greater agility in business, we want it to be responsive, innovative, and there will be different business models if we're really going to flourish. So I think that focus on purpose rather than the long-term versus short-term would be stronger. In terms of Germany, over-fetishizing Germany, I think often we always think the grass is greener somewhere else. I think that's quite right, and I think in terms of crowding in, we also need to look at actually where are we good in the UK. We've got some world-class leaders. We very rarely celebrate that. The media always picks up the bad news stories. If we want to showcase what is good in management and leadership, and I will come back on John's comment about management, we see it very much as a continuum. We need both management and leadership, and we are about better led, which is about leadership, and our vision of what management is about creating an environment where everyone can succeed. And actually, if you look at the world-class business schools across the UK, leadership is a core part of the element. And although it might be called management, I think is a misconception and a misunderstanding across the British society about what management is. And it has got clouded by Taylorism and some of the older concepts of what good and effective professional management and leadership looks like.
I went to a business school called INSEAD, and one of our first business cases was the British motorcycle industry. I went there in 1977, actually, a long time ago. It was a case study of the British motorcycle industry from 1950 to 1975, and the point of the case was that actually the way the British stock market and financial system operated meant that the British motorcycle industry consistently retreated from one segment after another, and could never get scale production. And actually, the high hurdle rates, the high discount rates, the short-termism, actually led to the elimination of the motorcycle industry. That was the story. Now I'm watching Aldi and Lidl, two German private companies, take British supermarkets apart, exhibiting exactly the same strategic kind of benefits that actually was used by Japanese and Germans when they took our motorcycle industry 4 years ago. You could write the same case at INSEAD. In fact, I think they're thinking of doing it on Aldi and Lidl, and how this German model that we must fetishize is once again taking us apart. I mean, John McDonnell made the point, he's completely correct, that our current account deficit is the highest proportion it's been since the 1830s. The way we run our enterprise system, we simply don't have a kind of internationally, we don't have a sector in internationally traded goods and services that actually is strong enough. And I believe, in 10, 15 years' time, that actually we simply won't be able to pay our way in the world by having an enterprise sector with the time horizons, discount rates and risk aversion that our enterprise sector has at the moment. And actually, I think it's really, really kind of a first order national issue, actually. We're talking a kind of not particularly badly, but not particularly well attended fringe. It's trying to recondite for many people. But actually, issues are, for my money, kind of absolutely the most fundamental. We have a risk-averse, depurposed enterprise sector. It is not. Its share of world goods and services is shrinking faster than our GDP is shrinking proportionately. We're in trouble, and actually. The route, a necessary if insufficient condition, and getting things right, to take this kind of agenda seriously, much more seriously than we do. And a first step to doing that is actually to stop kind of dismissing the German system and let's stop over-fetishizing it. Of course they have cock-ups, but in the main, they've got more right than wrong. We can't import it lock, stock and force smoking barrels into the UK. Of course we can't. But we can look at actually what the structures and processes produce and try to reproduce them in British terms around areas of our comparative advantage here. And I think it's imperative that we do.
Well, we've now reached 7 o'clock, and I'm sure people are very keen on getting a drink. I just want to say in conclusion that I agree with Will that this is absolutely one of the most fundamental questions that we should be discussing at this meeting or any other meeting. And secondly, I think that the cost of misbehaviour in business is going up. The likelihood that you will be caught if you do something wrong is going up. The likelihood that the company that you work for, if it is caught in doing something wrong, will be destroyed again, is going up. We see this with Volkswagen now, we've seen it with many companies in the past. So the utility of obeying the rules or being morally right, and the disutility of misbehaving, the second is getting greater. How we deal with this problem is very difficult, but I would say that there are two things absolutely at the heart of it. One is the issue of culture. I think we need to hardwire into the culture of corporations that behaving in a way that is ethical is incredibly important. We have to, as I say, I think if we define ethical too far up, then we undermine ourselves. But obeying the rules and being transparent and honest and decent in the way we behave. And secondly, that we need to restructure companies to make sure that they can monitor themselves much, much better than they have in the past. I think it was Madison